Well, welcome to the Next Steps podcasts, the time we take to talk about what we were talking about on Sunday and what it means for Monday. And to help us do that, we've got a bunch of people who've graciously given up their Sunday evenings, and I'll introduce you to them in just a moment. But you see their faces beaming at you through the screen if you're watching this on video, but if you're listening to me on audio, you've got no idea what I'm talking about. But we, as a church family, and I think as Baptists in Tasmania, want to take seriously the history of Tassie and the unfinished business that is still there. And so, as we launch into this discussion, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the First Tasmanian peoples as traditional owners and custodians of the land we walk on. And we also pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and for their care of country and seas over the past thousands of generations. We say thanks to God for their faithful stewardship of this land before whitefellas turned up. So, it's with that I introduce you to the bunch of people whose names, if you're watching on the screen, you can see on the screen anyway. But as we said, normally we would record this on a Monday. Because it's a long weekend, we're recording it on the Sunday evening. And Mitch, what have you been up to today?
I went to Hobart Baptist actually to see our former cast member, if you'd like to say, Matt Henderson's induction, which was really lovely to see him there and see the church community over there get around him. And I also caught up with some of our adults and went to the beach actually, so that was really nice.
Well, and for those wondering, we do need to acknowledge Matt Henderson, who has been the faithful host of this podcast, is now hosting Sunday services at Hobart Baptist Church. So if you want to catch up with him, that's where you will. And he was, as Mitch said, inducted today. At Citywide, we were looking at what does it mean to fast and pray. But before then, I introduced this new sermon series. The sermon series is Follow, Jesus Shows Us the Way, and really started by bouncing off a quote from Dallas Willard. Dallas Willard, I think I can may even be able to bring this quote up. This is a bit of a scary thing to do while we record this live, but let's see how we go. Maybe I can't. There we go. But Dallas Willard said, Jesus came to respond to the universal human need to know how to live well. He came to show us how, through reliance on him, we can best live in the universe as it really is. That's why he said, I came that they might have life and have it abundantly, from John 10:10. His supremacy lies in the greatness of the life he gives to us. Willard goes on, he says, putting Jesus Christ into a worldwide competition with all known alternatives is the only way we can give our faith a chance to prove his power over the whole of life. And I talked a little bit about some of the different things that often are the main things that take up our life and attention. And talked about how Jesus invites us to make him the primary force in our lives. I don't know, Paul, how you bounced off that first bit of the message as we talked about this wrestle for so many of us, because all kinds of other priorities come in, and Jesus is saying, if you make me the priority, this is where you find life.
Yeah, it was interesting. That is so true. I mean, I agree with that statement. It's pretty hard to argue with it. The bit that challenged me was the statement that, and the thought that Jesus came amongst the other things that are pulling people to show that he is the way. I love the way that Willard put it. I just find that a really challenging statement. I think about all the challenges we have out there as Christians, on all the challenges that anybody has in the world, and how we always have choices, but through it all, we can choose God, and Jesus is still number one and still top. So that's the bit that I really, really got out of it. I really love that thought, and that just resonated with me.
Well, I don't know, Dan, how you've spent a large chunk of your life as a missionary and now adjusting to being a pastor and doing your best to, with your whole life, serve Jesus. But there's this promise of whole life. How does that work out in practice in your life, and how do you process that?
Yeah, it's. I think one thing that stood out to me is when I was at college in year 11, I think it was, that there was a massive push in education that look after number one, and then everything else will follow after that. Like, look after yourself. It's just, and so that's one of the paradigms that I was walking around. It's interesting because it is a challenge. What that quote says is that Jesus, against all these other philosophies, is the best way of having a life to the full. So I find it an interesting question. I feel like it's going to take a little while for me to work out their responses, but from my experience, this lie of self-advancement, of finding your career and profession and being successful, of having a comfortable house, a strong family, a good education, that philosophy, I've seen plenty of people walk through that and still not find life to the full, still find life confusing and empty. And so there's something about life to the full doesn't depend on physical comfort So for me, I know when we brought up we moved to the UK as missionaries. We didn't have an income for 11 years except for gift income from those who believed in what we were doing. We were living in a 2-bedroom bungalow with our 4 kids, and the room was so small that you couldn't actually put 2 full-size beds in it. So I had to custom build a bed to fit the 4 kids in, and we were finding life to the full. Like, it was a real joyful thing of serving God and seeking first His kingdom. So yeah, but I think I've also had times through my Christian life where living a life of service to God without having prayer and intimacy with God has felt really empty, and it's actually been a deeply frustrating time.
Yeah.
And so I like this thing that we're talking about today of prayer and intimacy with God as being the core of what we're aiming for, not not just Christian service and sacrifice, because they run dry as well.
Absolutely. I don't know, Mitch, as you think about it, and this question, what does it actually mean to follow Jesus? How do you bounce off that question in your own life?
I just think following Jesus is, as I think Paul touched on there, is putting Him first despite the distractions. Like, at the moment, I'm actually doing a Bible plan. I'm just trying to do the Bible in a year. And I try and do that, just, do it every morning, and it really sets me up for the day, I feel like. However, of course, my distractions, I'm actually going through a bit of a phone addiction problems at the moment. And so my distractions are things such as YouTube or Instagram or, anything that it could be. And sometimes I just forget to do it. And I find that sometimes those days that I don't do it just aren't as good. I just don't feel... I can't really say, but it's just not the same. Like, spending that time of prayer from that Bible plan is really brings me closer and really sets me up for the day in that.
Yeah, mate, I love what you're saying there. I actually, I love what Dan was saying as he was sharing about. It's got to be more than just going through the motions, or it's got to be a priority. And part of this thing we were focusing on last year, and it sort of briefly touched on, is this process of learning to focus on Jesus. And it's kind of and it can't just be an act you put on. It's got to be really at the centre of what life is. I mean, and for you, as we get into this, and sort of, and you were sharing a bit of your own journey, we'll come to that. But just this thing of, as both Mitch and Dan are talking about there, it's so easy to get distracted, and it's got to be real. Following Jesus really has to be real.
Yep, I agree. So now I suppose I better elaborate on that, hadn't I?
That'd be great.
Sorry. Yes, it does have to be real. And what I love about God and our relationship with God is that He knows who we are. There's Psalm 139 that says from the, sort of, I have loved you, I have watched you since you were in your mother's womb. And wherever you go, I'm with you. Now, we can take that with us, and we can tap into it. But as we've all been talking, we get distracted, don't we? But there's like a taproot. One of the Bible verses that I talked about in my message was in Proverbs, about, we can be heartsick, and that kind of really stunts us. But a longing fulfilled is like trees of life, I think it was. I haven't got it in front of me, and I haven't memorized that particular verse, and it is sweet to the soul. And when I first read that word, it is, makes us, it's the tree of life. It actually brought to my mind some verses that have meant a lot to me through my own Christian walk. And those are in Isaiah. And it's actually one that Jesus referred to when He first proclaimed His ministry, about He had come to, free the captives and make the blind see, and that kind of thing. And then He goes on, and then He'll replace the oil and the spirit of mourning with the spirit of heaviness with with joy, and so forth. And then it goes on to say, and you will be trees of righteousness, the planting of the Lord. And for me, that's what we do when we follow. God plants us, and Paul says He plants us in love, and the roots we have go down deep in love. And Jesus, if you like, whether that's a tree or a vine, Jesus is the vine and we are the branches. It's like there's a root, and there's a main root that goes really down deep, and we're grounded. And even when we're distracted, it seems to me that we can still be grounded in His love. And He accepts that, we get on with our lives, and, I might be at work and I might not be thinking about God every moment of the day, or whatever it happens to be, or I might fly off the handle at something, and then I think, oh gosh, but I do believe that when we kind of follow God and we make an effort to focus on Him, then we remain in Him, as that John 15 verses 1 to 11 passage talks about, which you introduced, Matt, and then I quite independently introduced. And I think that was, for me, that could have just been coincidence. But I think when you believe in the Holy Spirit's working in our lives, I think it was like a little flag going up to say, don't forget about this. Don't just gloss over it. Take notice, and that, sort of, when you remain in me and I will remain in you, and when you love me and obey my commands, you will remain in me. That's following. And I love that Jesus understands us, and He understands our mess. In fact, when He came into mess.
Hmm.
And he came into a city and people who were so busy, and there was so much going on. There wasn't even a place for him to stay.
Hmm.
You know, there was just so much going on. There was no room for him,
Yeah.
and yet God made room for him. And I think God has a way of calling on us, and the Holy Spirit has a way of just reminding us. I mean, I don't know, I'm rabbiting on probably, and it may not make sense, but I think he calls us. He keeps calling us, and we can get distracted, but he's got a voice there that will keep saying, "Come back to me, come back to me." And
Absolutely.
yeah, and I think as we come back in prayer, and we might miss it for days, Mitch, as you say, and I have to say I'm guilty as that. Oh, guilty. That's not the right word, but I do that as much as anybody. And yet God still calls. The Holy Spirit still prompts, and if we're willing to not always catch on every time, you'll still be persistent.
Well, I think that's a really good way of leading into this next conversation, because we introduced the whole thing. We call to this life, but the reality is keeping, as Mitch was saying, keeping your focus on Jesus. I mean, the whole. I'm right now reading a best-selling book called Stolen Focus, which and it says that this whole world, their attention is getting more and more fragmented, and so this whole sermon series really is about what are the things you can do to gradually build that focus, to gradually sustain it, but also to acknowledge none of us have this together. We're all on a journey, and it's a and I'd love as a pastor to be able to say, gee, my relationship with God is always so good. You can really trust that I've got it together. I know what I'm doing. I just can't, and I don't know any honest pastors who can say that. But it is true. I've grown a bit. I've grown a bit over the years, and I'm some steps ahead of where I was, and that's why we're introducing these different behaviours, I guess you call them, or practices, and so that make up the follow acronym, and say these are the things, if you can build them into your life, they do make a difference. They actually make a difference. And we've been talking about fasting and prayer, and both Anne and I sort of introduced that. I kind of did the specific, and then Anne got to the heart of it. Paul, I guess, and you can see there for those watching on the screen, there's the acronym, and we'll be unpacking more, and also the description of what fasting is, which is really doing without food in order that you might be able to focus on God. And by the way, the Bible, the notes for these messages are always available on the YouTube link, so we'll have the link to that, and in the description of the podcast. So the show notes of the podcast, I believe they're called, they'll have the link to the sermon notes. Paul, for you, mate, so we're making this claim that fasting and prayer, if you can build them into your life, it helps this keeping focused on Jesus. Do you think it's right?
Do I think it's right? Yeah, I do. I think any time spent with God can only improve your lot in life. Can only improve the way you feel, the way you react. It can only make it better if you spend time with God. And the easiest way to do it is to do it without distraction. Hence the fasting. But I just think I did like your thing about prayer. A lot of people get hung up on the prayer side of prayer and fasting. But the prayer, we all have this idea of what prayer is, I think, in our heads. But my challenge is, and you mentioned today, was that prayer is not a set routine. Prayer is actually having a conversation with God and spending time listening for a reply. And it's that simple. So we don't have to make it this. We don't have to make it this really fandangled thing, this really, I suppose, special thing. It can happen in all your life. And it's just when you're fasting, that's when you've just got that little bit of extra focus. And I think that's what's so good about it. So it's not prayer and fasting is, not to, it's to withdraw yourself from the distractions of the world rather than actually withdraw yourself. It's actually to just make God bigger in the picture. And I think that's the point of prayer and fasting. It puts God back to the forefront where he always should be. And as you said, we don't always do that, but that's what to me. And so it is so important if you want to understand what God wants in your life, because God's got a plan for you. It's just whether we listen to it. And so, to understand that plan, I think you've just got to do the prayer and fasting, and I think it becomes easier, and it becomes you become more attuned to what God is trying to tell you.
I wonder, Mitch, what questions? For me, you're kind of exhibit A, a young bloke just who's probably heard a few less sermons on this sort of stuff than some of us, and sort of on wrestling to make it work. But as you hear about fasting and prayer, and we talked a bit about abstinence, which is giving up stuff that you think you might be a bit too dependent on but isn't necessarily food. How do you... What questions have you got about how you actually do it? So the whole point of the Next Steps podcast is we want to ask, how do you actually take next steps with this stuff? I guess for you, what would be some of the questions, or what would be some of the blocks or the things that would get in the road for you getting into fasting and getting a bit more serious with prayer?
Firstly, I think when we fast, is that primarily just because we have, say, a big decision coming up, or something that we need answers to, or that we want answers to, or is it just something that we do when we feel like we just really need time with God and time hearing from Him?
I don't know, Dan, how would you in your experience, what's fasting been part of your journey?
Yeah, fasting has often been, just the routine of it has been that we've often had fasted through till the evening meal. Often for a week we would skip meals through the day, and just have the evening meal to break the fast each day. I had a real strong view that there's no point in giving up food without actually spending a bit more time in prayer. You don't just fill your day with business and get on with stuff, but you actually use that time to really focus on God. There's something precious and symbolic, I think, about getting your body to actually physically act out spiritually what you're doing. So for me to be able to control my body and say, actually, I'm going to fast now and pray with God. Significant. I was thinking one of the main thoughts through this is I don't want to just be flatmates with God, like that God indwells me. I know for an intimate relationship, like for a husband and wife living in a house, you don't want to just be flatmates, like ships crossing in the night sort of thing, who just coexist. But I want to have this strong relationship with God, which means I invest in the relationship and I spend time with Him. And fasting is just one of the helpful routines that gives me some structure to hang that on. So
I think, can I just jump in?
Yeah,
Sorry, I am. So I think there will be times when you are at a crossroads, for example, in your life, and you're looking for guidance and you're not quite sure where's next and whatever, and then that is a big decision, and you may find that opportunity to fast is a way of just giving you some focus into that. And there might be other times, like I think of in the Bible, there were times when people saw, or they heard, I can't remember his name, was it Nehemiah? Anyway, that he found out he got some bad news about the situation, and he wanted to do something about it. In fact, it was the town of Jerusalem, and things were going to rack and ruin, and he felt that the time had come that maybe it was time to step in and do something. And the first thing he did was actually recognise and acknowledge in God's presence and through his fasting that they've stuffed it up as a people of God. And so sometimes fasting is about really working into, well, what does that mean? You know, where did we go wrong? How do we move on from this? So fasting can be about that. And then I think as part of fasting, it can be the big decisions. It can be that kind of thing. It can also be just this opportunity to be available, hear God, perhaps a little bit more intentionally, and to
So what have been some of your experiences with it, Anne, personally?
Well, to be honest, in my early Christian life, even as in my 20s, 30s, there wasn't a big focus on fasting in the churches that I attended. So I didn't really fast. I mean, it gets mentioned in the Bible, but there was no real focus on it in the discipline of fasting. And so, I wondered about it, but I never did it. I never thought about it as something that was really, worth incorporating as a discipline into my walk of faith. And then really, I guess I really didn't stop and think really hard about it as another next step, if you like, until Matt, you started speaking about fasting and really shining a light on it and focusing on it. And I'm one of these people who, for medical reasons, can't go on a prolonged fast. Yeah. But I can modify my fast, similar like Dan and his family modified their way of fasting. But what it did was, it was like an intentional, okay, we're fasting, we're putting some time aside. This is really about a focus on hearing God. Yeah. Absolutely. And I found that a really helpful actually, to do that.
I love it. I love it, because this is what we're talking about. In this podcast, we want to get to how does this actually work? And I love, like, if I'm to be honest, for me, I really didn't get into fasting till I ran out of answers. And it was actually when I think the first time I really got serious about fasting was when we were stuck in Canada, and I didn't have a job, and I didn't have any money, and it was all I could do. I was trying to provide for my family. I didn't have a way to do that. And so Leanne and I would go for walks, and we just started, and I just fasted and prayed. And I had a practice, like Dan was saying, of kind of not, because I didn't want it to disrupt my family life. So I would fast breakfast and lunch and then be there for the family meal. And then gradually we would have, in Fusion, we would have weeks of prayer and fasting, but I only nominally got involved with that. But then at Citywide, we've had some weeks of prayer and fasting and it really, I've only once in my life completely fasted for a whole week of all food. Not from when you're fasting, it's really important to drink water. And I once fasted from coffee. I ended up with a migraine, so I'll never do that again. So anyway, it's a whole other discussion. But this is where we're talking about but for me, it's been a really important process, and it actually, I think, strengthened my self-control. It actually, as I spent time in prayer with God, it did feel like something shifted. There was times where I was just really hungry and it was difficult. Even when it was just through till dinner time, it's a uncomfortable thing to do. I know, Paul. What's been some of your actual experiences with fasting? Have you had much experience with it?
Yeah, I've had a few forced fastings in the army, but they were quite interesting. But like you said, that's for another story. Fasting's been an interesting one. I suppose I've always thought of fasting as a big decision thing, and that's what Mitch was talking about before. What do you use it for? That whole church fasting to see if they sell the building, the church fasting, like in being part of that. I find that really moving. But what I've found though also is, it's that ability to actually just stop and spend time with God that's the important thing. So, and fasting or abstinence from something is the thing that you need to do that. And I think this is the catch-22 of it, I suppose. I've just talked in a circle. Back to the start, I think fasting, my experience with fasting is sometimes it has given me an answer and sometimes it hasn't. So I look back on it now and I go, was I actually listening to God, or was I doing it for myself, or was I not listening? So it's really interesting. Like, I've gone through times of fasting where I've come out none the wiser or none the clearer or anything like that. Other times,
me too.
Other times of fasting, it's really obvious what should happen. So the importance of fasting is real. Sometimes I think we might go into it expecting an answer, and I think we might situate the appreciation. In other words, we might go there thinking, oh, God's going to tell me an answer to this, when he's actually trying to tell you something else. I think that's the danger if we go fasting for a decision.
But yes, that's really helpful, actually, mate. I think I can acknowledge in me, sometimes I've gone fasting and I feel like I'm doing it to earn brownie points with God so he'd do what I was praying for. And I don't think that's actually what it's for. Like, I think that's dangerous territory.
And Matt, as everyone's talking, in fact, as Paul was talking, I had a picture of Jesus after he had, after God had said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased," and he'd been baptized and he came out of the water, and then it says he went out into the wilderness and he fasted for 40 days. That was a pretty mammoth fast. And I don't know what all the things that happened on that, but it's like he was at the start of his ministry. What a momentous moment. And he pauses in that, and he focuses on his time with his Father. But what happens toward the end of the fast is he goes through this incredible period of temptation, where he's being tested. What is it you really want from this ministry? When you do this, what are your motives? How much of what you're wanting to do is for God your Father, for out of love for humanity, and seeing us restored into love relationship with the Father.
So I love what you say. I think that's been my experience. Often with fasting, God has used it, and this is what Dallas Willard said too. He uses it to pinpoint your stuff and to help you face your stuff as much as get the answers to the particular prayers you have. And just as Jesus was taken into a time of fasting, and then at the end of that was able to then face and literally face his demon who was trying to get to him. Often fasting can be a time of having to face the drives in you that just wants to meet your own needs, and so I think that's part of it. I don't know, Mitch, how you've heard all that, but and Dan, I don't know if you wanted to toss in, but my sense is often fasting is for a bigger kind of thing. Sometimes it's like a combined time where we have a week of prayer and fasting. The church gets together, sometimes for a specific purpose, other times for just a thing.
There is something really precious doing it together. It's a different kind of fasting, but there is something really, I think, significant about us as a body of doing it together. The one thing that's really helped me a lot is I for my personal fasting, I really enjoy being outdoors, and actually I engage with God. I seem to engage with God more easily in nature, and so for me the best. We're using the word fasting, but I would often use the word retreat, where I just retreat with God into the forest or into the bush, and just go for a walk with him. And I like what you said there, Matt, previously. Is I feel like usually the main thing that happens is that God brings me back into alignment with him, and that's a place of peace.
Yeah, and it can be a real, like for me, it can be a real battle. Just part of me that I want my needs met. And if I'm hungry, I want to eat. If if I'm thirsty, I want Coke. I don't want water. I want something that tastes good. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. I don't know, Mitch, how you hear all that. And we're really only touching in a minute. Because we're going to throw to Andy here a bit about
I'd like to hear Mitch's response.
Yeah, but that's all right. But we'll in a minute we'll hear from Mitch. In a minute we'll hear from Anne. But just to give a heads up, before we hear from Anne, what I'd love to hear from you all is we're also talking about prayer, and we'll come back to Mitch to hear that response. But just for you to be thinking about, we were talking about prayer as well as fasting, and how do you keep track of the requests you've made in prayer for God? We'll get you to talk about that in just a minute. But Mitch, as you've heard people wrestling with all this stuff, how do you bounce off it?
Yeah, I just want to firstly say thank you. I thought that was actually really interesting hearing all your takes on that, and from what I got from that, I think I could look at it as you surrendering yourself and your needs and wants to more closely align yourself with God and to get closer to Him. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, it's a pretty good summary.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah. And it's not easy often. That would be true, in my experience.
Mm.
Yeah. But I think you nailed it, mate. I think part of the reason I want to ask about how you keep track of the requests you ask from God, I don't know, Mitch, how this works for you. Because we were talking about God wants you to ask for stuff. He actually wants us just to talk to Him, and I guess I just wanted to touch base and say, I don't know. We'll let anybody jump in here. How does that work for you? The asking for stuff from God, and do you find a way to keep tabs of that, or are there things that you are continually asking for, and you're don't want to steal the thunder about what you're going to talk about with your message in a minute, but you were talking about something you were asking for on a repeated basis, and I've got lists of things that I'm praying for and people I'm praying for on a regular basis. I don't know, just how does prayer, I don't know, any of us, how does prayer actually work for you?
I think it works on a number of levels for me, because for me, some of it is about actually saying, well, this is what I'd like, this is what I want. But there's another part of me, and this has to do, I don't know, maybe it's my personality, but I like the idea of contemplative prayer, which is where you have a lot of quiet and silence. And it does seem a bit odd, and I do find it hard to quiet all that inside voice that goes on. And sometimes it really, like, it might be only like for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, but the whole point is just to be quiet and stop and to say, I'm coming into your presence, Lord, and I'm going to be quiet.
Yeah.
And to sort of silence as much as I can those voices, and when I start getting distracted, I got distracted, but not beating myself up about it, just coming back into a quiet place. And sometimes I feel like God inserts things into that. It's like on one occasion, I'll come to that later. And yet at other times, I don't feel like anything comes other than knowing that I have come into God's presence. And then I've left God's presence to get on with my day.
Yeah.
But there's something really special about that, and there's a sense in which I've been held.
Yeah.
So that for me is part of my prayer life, and it's a very important part of my prayer life. And there are the needs where I ask for things, and I spoke about one in particular this morning where I'd asked, and I was confident that maybe this was finally the time when it was going to happen, and it didn't, and it sent me reeling. And I've been a Christian for a long time, and I think I've gained some wisdom and maturity over that time. But this one did me in and sent me back to a place that I've been on many occasions, to be honest, in my prayer life, in my walk with God, where I think, are you really there? Have you actually listened to what I asked for and what was really wrong with what I asked for? And why couldn't you deliver on this? But the other part of that is, and it was only afterwards when I felt, and this again is about being attentive, and even I felt this prompt. I believe it was the Spirit's whisper saying, you read something yesterday. Just think about what that was. And that was, of course, about thanking God for all the good things He has already done.
Yeah.
In that situation.
And I'm looking forward, because I think it's going to be a nice way to round off our conversation. This, because inherently the thing of prayer and asking God for stuff, often the answers aren't the ones we want, and we'll come to that, because it's really important to face that, because it's profound, and many of us carry scars, deep scars, for when the prayer hasn't been what we wanted it to be. I think before we get there, any other, keen to hear from you other guys too. Like, how do you manage your prayer life? Anne's talking about spending time in silence, but also asking for stuff. And look, one of our other practices is listening prayer, and we talked a bit about that in terms of listening to God. And it's kind of all tied up. But this thing of just fasting and prayer and this conversation with God and being willing to ask God for stuff. How does it work for you, Dan?
I have a different take on prayer, I think. It was really quite interesting listening to Anne, and I suppose my life story is slightly different to Anne's, but I give up asking God for stuff. If that makes sense, it's just bizarre. Like, I now look at life after losing a my wife. I look at life completely different. And so my prayer life is completely different now, and it is quite strange, because I go and I used to ask God for stuff. I used to ask God for things to happen, and now I figure just God's got it under control. We just have to accept the fact that God has it under control, and it might not be the outcome you always want, but He has that under control. And Anne talked about that bit today about having, even in the hard times, you can see God involved, and so. When my prayer, understanding that my basis for prayer is that God has it under control, it's not so much asking, it's just talking to God. Yeah. And I think it's just talking to God and having a conversation with Him, and most of the time it's not even it's never a why God. It's just that's happening. Is it God? Okay, that's how it sort of goes in my prayer life now. And it's just. Yeah, it's completely changed, and I think it's just an amazing way to be. For me personally, I used to, God, if you do this, I'll do that, type prayers, and then it's now, oh no, God's got it under control. I'll just go along with His flow and try and understand what that flow is. So that's what my whole prayer life is aimed at.
I love that. I think in a lot of ways that's the whole book of Job is about that, getting to that point where you can just go, yeah, okay, I'll stop trying to second guess you, and you're bigger than I am, and that's the whole. It's not a superficial thing, because it can be really frustrating when you think you know how God should do it, and very rarely does God work out the way you think you should do it. I know, Dan and Mitch, it'd be interesting to hear for you guys, how's prayer actually work in practice for you guys?
Do you want to go, Mitch?
Yeah, sure. Well, actually, I'd say last year I was not necessarily struggling, but I was actually searching for answers on how do I pray? Because I've heard many people talk about, our God being very conversational, very relaxed, and I've always wondered, is it just something we do? We just talk. we just, toss out our wants, our love towards him, our thanks? Or is it actually good to things in a semi-structured manner?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question. Dan, I don't know, Dan, if you want to bounce on it.
I was hoping Mitch was going to give the answer there.
Have you found any kind of answer to that, Mitch? Yourself?
Well, I did actually really find the structured way of doing stuff actually helpful for me, because I often like to pray before I go to bed, and I find that when I do structure it, my mind doesn't go crazy. I am sort of, I touch all the bases that I really want to touch. However, I have actually also found that just, laying my heart out there and talking to God is also really amazing as well. I sort of just did want to hear from you guys in your own experiences with that.
Yeah, it's similar to Paul. There has to be a balance in here somewhere, because there's things that I've desperately prayed for, and I couldn't understand why God wouldn't do it. I couldn't think of any reason whatsoever why God wouldn't intervene or wouldn't heal. And I think there's been a big journey of learning to trust that God's got it. So that is part of it, and to live in his plan and timing and stuff. But at the same time, I've also talked with a bunch of people who have, basically moved mountains through prayer, who have been real prayer warriors. I remember one of my favourite stories is I think if you want to talk about prayer, you can't go much further than Corrie ten Boom with a bunch of her writing. And I love her determination to work with God. Like I remember hearing a story that she was praying about something really fervently, and she held up a Bible and she said, "Look, God, here it is. You wrote it, so sort this out." And she was really like, I do feel like there's both being willing to trust God and allow him to do his thing and know that he's got it. But there is something in the power of prayer that I've been wanting to learn. How do you be a prayer warrior? How and what does that mean? How do you actually really invest in prayer and expectantly wanting to see God change? I don't believe in building spiritual credit and earning God's will. So that's some of the questions. I don't have answers to that. That is some of the questions. I know too many Christians who've really invested heavily in prayer and seeing God do amazing things.
Matt, can I just say one more thing before we do wrap up? In answer to Mitch about structure, I actually do think there's a really good place for that.
Yeah.
And I know for me, reading prayers that others have actually spent a lot of time putting together can be really meaningful and helpful for me. And, prayers formal prayers as part of a service, I think can be really helpful. And you can take those and make them your own. And, of course, there was the prayer that Jesus taught, Our Father. And I think it's like a model. And I often think of that. And I read a book called I can't remember what it's called, but it was by a woman called Madame Guyon, who lived in the 1800s, I think. But she spoke about prayer, and she spoke about how you could, Our Father, and then you spend time and you actually think about what that means, and that might change from one day to the next in terms of where you put that focus. Who is it? You art in heaven, hallowed be your name. And you put time into hallowing the name of Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit, the three in one. And, your will be done. What does that mean for you in this moment and God in this moment? As it is done on earth as it is in heaven. How do we help bring in the kingdom of heaven here on earth? And where do you want me in all of that? And that then opens up a whole lot of different avenues for prayer. And give us this day our daily bread. It's like, it's not only about praying about our own needs and our family's needs and so forth. I think it's, for me too, it's about saying, well, what do you want me to do, Lord? That it helps me it helps where you're saying help do something that helps meet other people's needs. And then there's the, forgive, our debts as we forgive others. And there's some real opportunities there to think about, well, where do I need to get myself right with God? And also to think about, well, it's grudges I'm holding? Are there things I need to release into, to God's care? And then, of course, lead us not into temptation. So again, we can use that as a hook in our lives.
So I think that really, I like what you're saying, Anne, and I think that's right. It was useful for me to discover that the Psalms, Jesus prayed the Psalms, and the Psalms were like the original prayer book of the Bible.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's a mixture. Being Protestants, we pride ourselves on trying to make prayers up, and it feels wrong and a bit too Catholic when we say stuff. But for me, it's been really helpful. Like, I've memorised Psalm 23. I'm working on memorising Psalm 100, and I pray those prayers, and I pray the Lord's Prayer. And for me, there's another prayer, the covenant prayer by Wesley, that I pray regularly and get the whole church to look at it every now and then. So I think structure, and for me also, I have a list of people I'm praying for on a regular basis, and that's how I structure some of my praying. And I actually write down next to them often what I'm praying for them, because my brain is terrible. I'm not a natural, I find it so hard to concentrate. It's even harder and harder. And so I need a bit of structure. But I like Dan was saying, I would so love to be a real prayer warrior, and I've got a way to go, I think, in my prayer life. I think most of us have. So not all of us are called to that. But I think that's also a bit of a cop-out. I feel like it's like we're learning with fasting. It's stuff you can build into your life and make habit. We've covered a fair bit of territory, and I'm conscious we've been going for a while, and we've sort of touched on bits and pieces that you did in your message. Is there stuff at the heart of what you were trying to communicate that you don't think we've quite got to yet?
There's one thing, and that was a sense of God desires us. And He so wants us to be in relationship with Him. And He wants us. He wants us to connect with Him. That's His longing. And He places within us, because we bear His image, He places within us a longing to connect with Him. And I mentioned this morning, there's, if you look at the Sistine Chapel, the ceiling, at the very centre of all the things that are going on in that piece of art, you see a picture of God with this big arm and hand reaching out to grab this rather flimsy, a nice-looking man's hand, but nevertheless very small in the scheme of things, connecting with God. And God, it's like their fingers touch. And that's God's desire. He's reaching out to us. He desires, He wants us, He longs for us. And through prayer and fasting.
And I think that's a really lovely way to sort of circle back and to where we started, saying, look, the heart of this is Jesus offers us life. God is reaching out to us through Jesus, and He wants to do life with us. That's the heart of this whole, and that's why it's really dangerous to be. It's easy to get sidetracked and think, okay, I've got to try harder at fasting, I've got to try harder at prayer, I've got to work it, and you get driven and get head down the wrong path. But I don't know. I'm conscious we do have to wrap it up. So for each of us, I guess, as we come close to wrapping up, and then we'll talk about what's happening next week. What are you left with, or what would you like? As from this conversation, what are you taking away from it, and what would you like people to take away as they're listening to us talking about the relationship with Jesus, following Jesus? When prayers don't work, and we've covered so much territory. I guess what for each of you, Katie, for each of you, What do you take away, and what would you like people to take away from this conversation?
From
I'll
my
go first.
perspective, yeah, go Paul. Go Paul.
The one thing I would encourage people is there's no right or wrong way to pray, and and to actually be the prayer warrior that we all aspire to. I actually believe that's a gift from God to be a prayer warrior. So we want to have the best prayer life we can, but don't compare yourself to prayer warriors unless you happen to be one.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks, mate. Dan, what were you going to say?
Yeah, just I feel reinvigorated to make sure that I've got. I think a helpful routine for me is one day a month that I set aside for God, and that I pray and fast and get out and on retreat with Him. I think that's what I'll take away. So you can actually ask me how I'm going to structure that in, because structure is helpful. Yep. So give me an ask, and I'll be having a day a month where I'm just retreating and fasting. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, and which is going to be good, because next week we're going to be talking about Sabbath and the importance of having space away. So that's the plug for next week. I don't know, Mitch or Anne, what are your takeaways, or what do you want people to take away from this?
I think, Mitch, I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah, well, I've actually found this podcast actually really good today, because I think I've really learned about just what fasting just generally is, just straight off the bat. I mean, I already knew, but just to have that solidified. But to then also, with what Paul just referred to, just with prayer, and there is no right way, and just it doesn't need to be chill. It doesn't need to be. It can be what you need in that moment to be with God, and really amazing.
Yeah, and I think the point is that everyone can pray. Everyone, and we can pray differently, and that's fine. That's okay. That's good, because we are made in the image of God. We can pray, and we're all made in the image of God. And I guess for me, the takeout is just a reinforcement that God is faithful. That passage I read this morning from Lamentations. His mercy, his his compassions, they never fail. And they are new every morning. He remains faithful through it all. And sometimes we just have to wait on Him and put our hope in Him. And we do. And prayer is a place to start.
Yeah, that's great, Anne. I think for me the takeaway is it's okay where you are, but you don't have to stay where you are. And there is you can, like, I love what Dan's saying. I said this morning, like, unless you're intentional in your relationship with Jesus, unless you make choices, then Jesus isn't going to be the center of your life. Other stuff will take over. And so this thing of fasting and prayer, you don't accidentally fast, really, and you don't really accidentally pray. I accidentally end up looking at Twitter. I accidentally do lots of things. I don't accidentally have a really good prayer life. And so I think I've been wanting to encourage people to stick with us over these coming weeks, and so we're talking about next week. We're talking about Sabbath. We're following this acronym through. So there's if we started with today, fasting and praying. Next week is observing Sabbath. Then we're going to be talking about listening prayer and listening to God. Then we're going to talk about learning the Bible and how you get into that. Then we're going to talk about offering tithe and time, offering. You're being ready to sacrifice yourself, and finally we're going to talk about worship. Each week we're going to dig into each one of these categories, and next week I think something we don't talk enough about. It's people hear Seventh Day Adventists talk about Sabbath a fair bit or whatever, and can or read the Old Testament thing. That's just an Old Testament thing. But I really do think Sabbath is important, so we'll be talking about that next week. So that's all tied up both my encouragement from this week and also what we'll be looking at next week. So thanks. I want to say thanks to Paul, Mitch, Dan, and Anne for taking time out of your Sunday night to record this, which will be going live on Tuesday. And we would love, all four of us, five of us, I was just trying to, my maths isn't good, five of us, would love your comments and feedback. You can do that by just in the, if you're watching on YouTube, just in the comments down below. If you're on any of your podcast platforms that you'll be listening to this on, we would love it if you could leave a review or let people know about it. Help us get the word out. But most of all, the reason we're doing this is to really help people. We call it next steps because we don't want to just listen to stuff. We want what we talk about on Sunday to influence how we live Monday, and that's what the Next Steps podcast is all about. So, thanks everybody for being part of it, and we will see you next week.
Mm-hmm.